Thanks, Sonny. Thank you for having me today, because as you can hear, I'm the foreigner here, not because I'm French, but because I live in Dunedin. And, and also because my work is actually based in the far land of Southland. So for those who've been there, who've been brave enough to go down there, just bear with me, because as much as braided rivers are probably threatened in Canterbury, you should try and drive through Southland to see what they look like down there. So before you also, I'm from Dock, I work for Dock, and I'm actually gonna talk about gravel extraction. So before you go like, oh, can a Dock person work with gravel extractors? Bear with me, I'll try to show you why sometimes you have to make the unlikeliest of association. So by now you all know that braided rivers are pretty special in New Zealand. They're actually considered one of the rare ecosystems. They're less than 1% of New Zealand area, going down, as you've seen, because the braid plains seem to be reduced. They're an iconic ecosystem in terms of landscape and scenery. There's the Dart River in Queenstown, and obviously Canterbury is spoiled for choice in terms of braided river. But they're actually present across New Zealand, from Hawke's Bay down to Southland, West Coast, Otago. Not very many in Otago, but a couple that are under a lot of pressure. And they actually contain a high proportion of endemic and threatened species, de facto because it's a small ecosystem, but also because the pressures are so high. You've all seen by now quite a few of those pictures at the Rangitata River, the difference between 1942 and today. And they lost about 2/3 of the braid plain. So obviously all those iconic species, not only the habitat is reduced in surface, but by narrowing the braid plain, we've actually hydrologically induced something that was kind of unplanned, or probably wished by whoever was narrowing those braid plains, is that when you start reducing the room for the river to move, it moves from braids to meander. So it narrows down, starts digging down, because there's more water flowing through a smaller area. And when it starts doing, then it starts bouncing off the sides. So all that was actually making a braided river by now is gone. So the ecosystem function are extinct. The habitat is unsuitable for native braided river species, especially birds, because there's no feeding ground, no nesting ground, no roasting ground. So there's no way for the birds to live. And even when they try, because all the weeds have colonized the riverbed, then you've got a massive density of introduced predators, because it's easy for them to commute and to feed in. So you might think that I'm painting a very bleak picture, because again, in Canterbury, you've got such massive braided rivers that some of them at least look still like braided river. But when, like I said, when you start going to Southland, it's a very different picture. And actually most of historically braided river in Southland look more like these ones. So you've got willow lines, and within what's left of the braid plain, you've got rivers just bouncing off the sides, single channels. So the question down there is, how can you turn the meanders back into braids? And it goes beyond trying to spray a few weeds. Like Environment Southland spends about $200,000 a year spraying brome and gorse on braided rivers. And I've been there for a few years. It makes no difference. Every now and again, you show up to a part of the river, the brome is dead, and all they've done is kill some brome. You come back a year later, and the seed bank is such that it's already resprouting. But it's done nothing to actually help the river, because it's so ingrained, like all the fine sediment is so fixed that unless you go a bit deeper, you're not going to make any difference. So the project is based on the Aparima River near Wreys in Southland, which is a long way from Canterbury. It's all the way down the bottom of the South Island. And by now it's actually involving a lot of people, obviously the gravel extractors themselves, Department of Conservation, but the project started in 2016, but I only inherited it about 2 years ago. And what I did when I inherited it was go to all those guys and go like, hey, we need to work together on this, because otherwise it's not going to work. So Fishing Game, University of Otago, got a couple of students doing some work down there. Environment Southland is warming up to some of the ideas we're putting through, which is great to see, because after looking at the presentation this morning, I'm shaking in my head at the difference between what ECAN is willing to do for river management to what Environment Southland is still not willing to do. So that's a very interesting difference to notice. And I've also re-engaged with TAMI. So TAMI stands for Te Ao Marama Incorporated. So they sit with Environment Southland, but it's an organization that bridges the gap between the regional councils and the different Runakas. So every time you try to engage with Runaka at place on those matters, you go through TAMI. So they just facilitate engagements with Manawhānui. It's actually working pretty well because I've got some really nice contact with an engagement through TAMI. And really the main goal of the project was hardcore habitat restoration, because like I said, there's hardly any braided river habitat left. And one of the main monitoring tools we use to see if it works is birds, and especially black-fronted tern, black-beaked gulls, and banded dotterels. And some of the main issues are pests and weeds, but also now I'm starting to look at what's the effect on freshwater values. So that picture is, again, it's one you've seen before, but it's actually the site I work at. So on the left is aerial picture from only the 1980s. So you can see it's not looking great at the time, but there's still a bit of room for the river to move. You can see bare gravel, braids, and that's just straight out of Google Map today. And as you can see the landmark there. So it's definitely the same site, but you can see what the river's become. And it's only about 40 years. So what's interesting in those two pictures is two of the landmarks that allow you to recognize the site is this by the bridge, which is the McGregor raised bush concrete plant, and that house here, which is actually the house of Grant McGregor. So the guy who owns and runs the plant actually lived there, and he's lived on the river his whole life. So he's been the witness of what's happened on the river. And as much as you might think gravel extractors are the problem, he's actually come to realize that they might be part of the solution. So the whole idea of the project came from him. So credit needs to be given when credit is due, because the whole thing started with his understanding of what the rivers become and of the problem and what he could do in his role as gravel extractor. So if you read New Zealand Geographic on a regular basis, there was actually a mention of Grant McGregor and the work he was doing on the Aparima River in an issue in 2019 about black-beaked gulls. Because at the time it had hardly started the project I'm going to talk about, and the black-beaked gulls had already come back to nest on what he was doing. So he's been really key to the project itself, but also he's a man of many talents, and he's got a finger in all the pies in Southland. So he's been a massive factor in actually putting the information out there and getting traction behind it. So really, every time I've presented the project locally enough for him to come, he's come. So I've gone to Doc, I've gone to everywhere to present the project, and every time he was there to talk about it. So he's really involved into it, and he's been like the main factor behind it. At the moment, still, it's slowly changing, but at the moment, the best practice for gravel extraction in Southland is you stay away from the water. You want a consent for gravel extraction in Southland, you want to make your life easy, you stay as far away from the water itself as you can. And then just to make it easy for you, you limit the surface, you're gonna have to clean the vegetation off. And then you dig deep to get as much gravel as you can, and you create a habitat pond, which has been the mitigation technique for the last 20 to 30 years. And what you're left with is a river that's still narrow and fast, a lot of weeds, and a massive big hole that looks good for a couple of years because you've got clean and fresh water coming from underground. But as it gets clogged by sediment, it turns into like a green soup that's literally turning toxic at some point. So quite a few operators have sold that as a marvel of ecosystem, like create habitat. You got ducks for duck shooting and all that, but in all truth, they don't serve much purpose. So the idea that Grant had was like, well, I'm a gravel extractor, I need the gravel, but I come to realize that what we're doing at the moment just doesn't work, and it's not helping the river, it's not helping us, because we're actually running out of places to dig massive holes. So can we do things differently? So if you go to most of the river in Southland, that's what it looks like. So right here on that picture, the river is flowing all the way down there by those willows, and you'll have like oceans of grass that basically have no ecological value left, because difference also between Southland and Canterbury is that most of those rivers don't have any native vegetation left growing on them. So you're left with ocean of grass and weeds, usually at the beginning, but as those grass start accumulating sediments, and the brome and the gorse will start kicking in. So at the moment, most gravel extractor will come, stay away from the water, dig a big hole, and go away. And Grant's idea was like, oh, why don't we clean the whole area and take the gravel by layers, so we kind of lower down that gravel bar, and then let the flood water come over the top and start to try and reclaim the land, basically. So one of the pushback we've had is like, you start explaining you want to do that, and people go like, oh, you want to go back to beach skimming. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but it seems to like raise a lot of eyebrows down in Southland. When you start talking beach skimming, a lot of people are like, you can't do that. So it's actually not what we're advocating for. It's kind of same, but actually very different. So if you go to the river, it looks like that, a lot of weeds, like deep channel, a tiny bit of a beach. Beach skimming back in the days was the go-to technique because it was easy. You could get clean gravel very quickly. So you took the digger to the beach and dig below the water level. So it was easy to get clean, and then the next flood would bring some more gravel, so you could do that again. And there was a lot of pushback back in the days because obviously a lot of sediment were flowing down. It was quite dangerous. Fish and game pushback, iwi manafenua pushback, rightfully so. But then we moved completely the other way and started going away from the river and dig like big holes at the back of those big gravel bars. And to be fair, Doc signed up on that for a long time, because the only value we could see in those places was water, fresh water. So we're like, if you stay away from the water, you're not having any negative impact. But to be honest, I don't think there's anything to negatively impact in those places. So what we're advocating to, and that what Brad was testing in this project, is actually clean up the weeds, clean up the overburden, take it away from the river, and start taking the gravel that you need, but stay above water level. So basically now the river has place to move. The floods can actually use the whole braid plane and start recarving side braids if he wants to. And that's exactly what he did. So when finally he got a bit of people in Dock started listening, credit to Richard Maloney, who was actually probably one of the first one to believe Grant and give him credit and actually help him designing that. So finally in 2015, he got a consent to do exactly that. So that area is the area that was consented to actually try what he had advocated for probably about 10, 15 years. And I put that yellow star here to show you, because it's obviously an aerial picture and you can't really quite see what's going on, but all that brown area is actually grass and kind of sprouting brome and gorse. But if you stand there on that yellow star by the river, that's what you're looking at. So if you stand by the water, that weed would probably be a meter above your head. And that's actually quite interesting because there's gravel, but you can see some of the floods have gone over the top, but haven't cleaned it. They've actually deposited more sediment. So all that it does, it builds upon itself. So even big floods will go over the top, but they will actually deposit more sediment. So it's not cleaning it, it's just building and building until the river doesn't actually go over the top of that. So unless you drastically change that and mechanically reset the clock, you're not going to get anywhere. So that's aerial picture in 2018 when Grant had started doing the work. So you can see the difference. He started cleaning quite a bit of the overburden and weeds. So commonly in Southland, when the extractors clean up a bit of overburden to get the gravels, they just push it in the willows. But what Grant did was contact the farmer next door and was like, do you want some topsoil? And the farmer was like, yes, please. So he basically drove the sediment and overburden into the paddocks, and the farmer could have it for fertilizer. So that's one of the things we're also advocating for in Southland. Now, if you scrape the overburden, it needs to go away from the river. Because if you start piling it up on the sides, the next flood will bring it down to the estuary and smother everything. But that was like groundbreaking for Southland, which is quite interesting because it's a no-brainer if you think about it. But that's, anyways. So that's about 2 years after Grant started, and you can see that it already looks cleaner. All the wide areas are clean gravel. And at the time, he was slowly working his way through the overburden. But as soon as he started doing that, that area got colonized by a colony of about 250 black beagle pairs. And he was working there, and basically at the time he was like, what am I supposed to do? Because the birds are landing by the digger to nest. And that was kind of funny because the juveniles would land on the digger, but they didn't really care. But when the workers at the time were going to do the bird monitoring, they had to hide behind the digger because the birds didn't want to have anything to do with them. They were fine with the digger, but they didn't want anybody to get anywhere near them. So it was a bit of a weird situation where we were basically telling Grant, well, obviously carry on because they like what you're doing, but we couldn't even monitor the bird because we were getting attacked. So pretty funny. When finally in 2020, it finished the work, you can see the massive difference between before he started and now, but also at the same time on the other side, someone got a consent to go the old-fashioned way and dig the massive hole to get some gravel. And actually that's still going. So by now the pond is about that big, but all that area is still about 2.5 meters above water level and it's still covered in grass. So you might think, well, actually that's good because you don't have any negative impact on the rest of the river. But again, I would argue that there's nothing to negatively impact. So it's really like a matter of really what's the best way to go. Because if you think about it, we need gravel, we need the aggregate. You want to drive on the road, you're not gonna slide off at every turn. So we need the gravel, but it's just a matter of trying to find a way that works for everybody. And if you look just locally, so the bridge, the Wreys bridge is just there. The number of sites that approach could be used locally by gravel extractors is mind-numbing. You look at Google Map and the Aparima River all the way to the estuary, it does exactly that, just bounces off the side, and all those areas are built up gravel point bars. So all these ones are prime candidates for kind of rolling out the technique and making sure it works out. And yet, in the meantime, the only consent that was granted by Environment Southland was for a big pond. And by now, that pond is about that big. He hasn't provided any habitat for anything down there. The problem is, at the moment, one access point is one site, and that's very expensive for gravel extractors. So another conversation I'm having down in the south is that under what condition do you allow machines to cross the river? And I'm actually surprised to see some of the presentations this morning where I could see dozers going into the water and cleaning stuff up. Like if you ask for that in Southland, you'd get hanged. Like I've spoken to Fulton Hogan down in Go, and they were like, oh, we can do that for you. We can clean that area for the overburden. And I kind of joked, I know what the answer would be, but I was like, oh, can you do that on the other side of the river? It's like, hey, you crazy? We're not asking that to Environment South, and they never let us cross the river, which is kind of funny because in the grand scheme of things, you might lift a bit of silt when the digger crosses, but in the grand scheme of things, it's probably still much better than having those weeds growing everywhere. So it's really discussion that's very different from different regions. But the question you're probably asking, all right, that's all well and good. So it looks great, but does it have any value? Did it make any difference? So one of the main thing we monitored were birds, so river birds actually using the river for habitat. So basically the way we did it is we split the site in two. So there's a treatment section above the Wreys bridge because that's a restored site, but Grant is actually doing some more work in those sections. So there's actually more gravel work going around. And we have a controlled section downstream of the bridge. So that, again, that's the same bridge, and nothing is done down there apart from that one pond I was showing you that's around here. And we monitored some key species: black-billed gull, black-fronted tern, banded dotterel, seapows, and pied stilts, just because sometimes you only have one of the species, so you need a bit of a panel of species. Looked at the amount of nests, the number of nests, nesting successes, and all that. But the patterns are pretty striking. It's like different picture from different year, but that's the treatment sites, and the colored dots are nests from different species. Treatment sites, control site, treatment site, control sites, and you can see, and that's just above the bridge. Last year there was a black-fronted tern colony, and that was literally 6 months after Grant cleaned up all the grass and overburden. They tuned in onto it really quickly. And if you look at the control side where no work is done, some of the tiny beach are actually, you can find lone seapow nests, but that's about it. And if you look at more like finer scale, in 2020, 2021, it was a really bad season for any bird nesting on the river, but the only black-fronted tern colony we had was exactly where Grant had done all that work. Unfortunately, for another reason, there was no happy ending because it was a really bad season for rats. And even though there was we cleaned up most of the grass, the rats still were coming from the willows, and most of the nests got raided. And that was last year, same site. So we didn't have a big colony of terns, but we had dotterels, stilts, seapows, and actually the dotterels nested several times on that site. When down on the treatment side, we basically got nothing. So last year was the halfway mark for the project, which is a 10-year-long project. So what have we learned? Well, it works. It actually removed the overburden, removed the weeds, recreated the habitat, recreated some of the braids. So that was the positive side. But that was a picture I took the first time I visited the site, or one of the first time, and that was less than a year later. You can see how quickly the weeds are coming back. And one of the issues we have in Southland is that because Grant has gotten the gravel he was supposed to get within his consent conditions, we can't do anything now. So basically, that picture, I was probably standing by the river with Grant, and he had this digger parked here, and he was like, the only thing I would like to do is get the digger down there and clean it up, but I can't. Because if I do that, then I get hammered by the regional council because my consent has expired. So at the moment, what I'm trying to do with him is get him a consent just for the maintenance. So he's not going to get any more gravel. He's just going to clean it. So what's the picture I was seeing of what you can do in Canterbury, just getting diggers and dozers and raking. I can't do that in Southland because the regional council will not allow me to do that without a new consent, which is a bit frustrating. So last year we actually got one extra nesting season out of the site by just doing some weeding, but it's not sustainable in the long term. So really, one of the plan is to try to work with gravel extractor and get them resource consents for maintenance work, at least for the ones that are willing to do it, and is gaining traction. So more and more of them are willing to work with us to do that kind of work. So really trying to turn that into a win-win situation. You can get you can get a bit of gravel if it's accumulated of a certain level, but if you could do the cleaning, and some of them, like I said, are willing to do that for free. And if you put a price tag on it, obviously dog cannot afford to do that, especially not now. So in the long term, trying to get gravel extractors to actually do that and include that into all the consents. And he's starting to gain traction because gravel is at a premium at the moment. So when you start telling them, look, we'll make your life easy, but you need to meet us halfway, they're more than willing to do it. So we're getting there slowly. And obviously the other issue is the predators. You're not learning anything here. Because we do a bit of predator tracking and monitoring as well, and we've got all of them. You name them, we have them, same as Canterbury. But those pictures are interesting because you can see a pattern into those pictures. All those predators, most of them are actually found in that really thick grass. So we've actually started to notice in our monitoring that as far away as they can, the birds are nesting from the grass, they're actually doing better. If when the tern colony get big and some of the individuals have to nest on the periphery too close to the grass, they're always the one to get hammered. So you know how people go like broom and ghost, but what we notice in the south is that the grass is actually the main problem, because all those pests are actually commuting into the grass and just shooting onto the gravel at night and just raiding the nests really quickly. So grass is our main problem down south, but yeah, we've got everything. The cats are actually the stretch of the river we monitor. We've done some GPS tracking for cats. So when we were catching them, we estimated that 8 kilometers stretch of river, we've got up to 80 feral cats roaming the river. And some of them commute tens of kilometers to come to the river. So yeah, cats are a massive problem too in Southland. And just like a few pictures to illustrate, so that's a black-fronted tern, the nest, and the next night you get a rat just come. And the cats do come on the river because they're quite mobile, and because we don't have any island, because the river is bouncing off the side, the cats are just roaming everywhere. One unforeseen consequence of the work we did is that as soon as you clean the river and you start making it pretty and a good playground, people actually come back. So what we've done has attracted a lot of humans, and between the ones that don't give a toss and the ones that don't know, we've actually had quite a bit of damage done last year. So that's a trail camera. We put trail cameras on our nest, so that's a dotterel nest on the ute driving right past it. And this one is quite sad because you see the dotterel on its nest and the dogs are just sniffing around. You know what Labradors do? They basically didn't even eat the eggs, but just sniffing around, and you can see the parent coming back to try and bring the eggs back onto the nest, but they're broken. So, and those people I know the dogs, I know the dog owners, and they probably just didn't have a clue. So it's a bit sad, but that's something we didn't anticipate to happen. So we're working on that as well, putting up some signs and trying to get people educated. But it's quite interesting because Southland has a very anti-dog culture, so it's not always easy to be the dog guy trying to tell people to share the river with their rightful owners. So summary, the first 6 years of the project, some good, some bad, definitely made a lot of progress and getting traction from a lot of different stakeholders, engaging more and more with Mana Whenua, which is great. And it's when finally you've got on your trail camera some of those guys being fed and looking healthy and fledgling, basically it's all worth it at the end, because 10 years ago, before Grant did any of the work, there wasn't even any bird to look at. So anything is better than nothing. Next step, I managed to get, well, I wrote everything, but Grant submitted the application. We got $30,000 from Environment Southland to actually roll out a trapping network. So we're gonna have like 300 trap boxes and 30 team traps and 30 Steve Allen cat trap going out on the river next week. So I'm going down next week to start rolling out the trapping network, and hopefully we never get that again on our trail cameras, but maybe that's wishful thinking. So yeah, that's me. If you have any questions, hit me. Thank you very much.